So much of the writing out there is dishonest. There's a crisis of trust. Nobody trusts the media.
You call yourself the Honest Broker. What is the story of the Honest Broker?
I launched my Substack newsletter 3.5 years ago. My subscription base has grown 30% in the last 10 weeks.
I saw that.
This is why I write directly for the reader. It's very difficult to come out with something creative or fresh because the system will shut you down.
You hate formula.
I hate formulas. I believe we are within 10 years at most from the culture reversing.
So as a writer, if I don't like dopamine culture, but I kind of feel like I need to be part of dopamine culture, I feel like I need to get right to the point, what do I do?
Well, here's my advice.
Okay, I love this episode. Love it. But after the interview, a friend sits me down at dinner. He's like, all right, it's a good interview, huh? So tell me, why should I listen? And my answer was I didn't really know what to say. So I go home that night and I'm like, what? How should I have responded? And I see this YouTube comment that nails it. It says this: he's a beautiful synthesis of head and heart. So who is he? Well, Ted is the world expert in jazz music, and that's where he began his writing. But the thing that stands out about him is the way that he's built his career. There's so many writers who are trying to game the algorithms, or trying to get big, quick, boom, 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 go, growth. But Ted took a different strategy. He's been reading the classics every day for something like 50 years. 50 years. You name it, he's read it. He's listened to the album. He's read the book. This guy knows the Western canon. So if you like this interview, I got one recommendation. Check out his Substack and start with a piece called The Western Canon Isn't What You Think. Man, you're going to love this interview, and I'm jazzed to share it with you. But all right, I'm going to start off with a compliment that I don't think you're going to like, but it's a really nice compliment.
Let me hear it.
I think that out of any guest I've had on the show, you really embody the word erudite. And I just have to compliment you on that.
Well, thank you. And I want to disclaim any extreme erudition. You should meet my older brother if you want to meet someone who's erudite. And actually, no one has been more surprised than me how much it helped my writing.
On that note, what do you make of the shift towards minimalism in writing, a sort of shorter sentences, simpler words, write to a fifth grader? And it seems like the same thing has happened in music. It seems like the minimalist style, even in interior design, has sort of taken off.
A minimalist aesthetic dominates everything right now.
Yeah, what's going on?
American prose still has not recovered from Hemingway. Now, don't get me wrong, I admire Hemingway. He's an amazing writer, but this idea of really short, choppy, powerful sentences, and he got some of that from other writers. I think Dashiell Hammett did a lot of that. I actually think Hemingway got a lot of it from the prose of Ezra Pound. Hemingway and Pound were friends in Paris. If you read Ezra Pound's prose, not his poetry, it's got that short declaratory sentences. It's very punchy. And that became the American way of writing. And even people in France or Germany or whatever, they would see those short, punchy sentences as an American way of writing. I don't think we've ever fully recovered from that. And I think that a lot of great writing comes out of that tradition. But I miss the maximalist style.
Me too.
So I'm an admirer of Moby Dick, or the few recent authors that have a maximalist style. Probably the greatest example is David Foster Wallace.
That's exactly what I was thinking of.
You know, Infinite Jest is one of my favorite books just because of his courage in doing the maximalism. And it's like Proust. You'd be reading a sentence in Proust and you forget what the subject of the sentence is. And David Foster Wallace is like that with the footnotes. Like, you'll be reading a sentence, there's a footnote, and like you go back to the back of the book and the footnote is 4 pages or 5 pages, like a short story. And after you've read that, you've forgotten where you are in the book. I admire that. I wish there was a return to a more maximalist prose style. Not everywhere. You know, when you read the newspaper, you're not looking for that. But still, and I do think there will be a return to maximalism. I think everything goes into cycles. I wouldn't be surprised if someday if I wrote a novel, I would just do deliberately something maximalist and elaborate, almost pushing it to an extreme degree as an aesthetic statement, saying, hey, we can do this. These tools are available to us as a writer. There's no reason why we should renounce them. But for the most part, you're right. There's a minimalist aesthetic permeating everywhere in our culture now.
Everywhere. It's the water we swim in. I want to talk about you. You call yourself the Honest Broker. What is the story of the Honest Broker?
Well, I gave myself that nickname, but there's a story behind it. And I have to say up front, it's not an especially sexy nickname. I know other music writers have better nicknames. Like my friend Stanley Crouch, the late Stanley Crouch, he called himself the Hanging Judge. And what a great name for a critic. I'd love to be the Hanging Judge. And this is how I became the Honest Broker. I don't know how much you know about my background, but there's a whole side of it I rarely talk about. You know, I've got a degree in economics from Oxford, an MBA from Stanford, and I did a lot of things, especially in Silicon Valley, in business interests for powerful people who had business problems. And they sent me all over the world to solve their problems. And often they had very difficult problems. And this was the way I made my living. Because for a long time, I didn't earn enough from writing. Let me tell you, that's a hard thing to do. So I had a day gig, but my day gig wasn't like other people's. And once, this is going back some time, I was trying to help a huge company set up in China. And they sent me out there. And they gave me some introductions. So one of my patrons there was one of the richest people in Hong Kong. And he introduced me to his friends. And all of a sudden, I've got these powerful people in China who are giving me advice. But the advice kept contradicting itself. One person would tell me one thing, another person would tell me another. One person would say, well, you got to set up in this region. Another one said, no, you want to be in Beijing or Shanghai or whatever. And I was hopelessly confused. And then one night, at a bar in a hotel, I met this drunk Australian.
Oh, wow.
Who changed my life. The drunk Australian, I don't even know his name. The drunk Australian changed my life. I was explaining to him my problems, and he had been working in Asia for decades. And he would tell me, oh, I know how I've been in Jakarta and Shanghai and Tokyo and Korea, you name it, I've been there. I've worked with all the people, and I know how to get things done in Asia. He said, I can solve your problem. Oh, great. What's the solution to my problem? He said, Ted, you go to China. You're going to set up a business. You go to some area. You need to find the honest broker. What do you mean? No, you need to find the honest broker. Now, well, this sounded great, but this is like, go find the Wizard of Oz. What are you talking about? I said, no, let me explain to you how it works. In China, we don't have rule of law. In China, you can't trust the court system. It's very difficult to do business there. But in every community, there is a person who is the honest broker. He's the person in that community that everybody trusts. And he knows how to make introductions to other people you can trust. And I said, well, why will he do this for me? He said, Ted, you won't believe it. He's not even going to charge you. But let me clarify, he's not going to charge you up front. You're going to become one of his contacts. He's going to help you get established. He's going to introduce you to people. He's going to give you advice you can trust. He's going to introduce you to people that are honest. And then maybe a few years later, he'll ask you for a favor.
Sure.
And that's how the honest broker works. And China cannot operate without the honest brokers in every community. Okay, now how do I relate this to writing? And you got to realize I'm doing all this business stuff, and I'm writing on the side. Well, this honest broker advice proved to be very useful in China. Now I'm back home and I'm writing on music. And I'm seeing how so much of the writing out there is dishonest. You can't trust it. In fact, it's gotten worse since that time, because if you look at surveys now, nobody trusts the media. They don't trust the experts. They don't trust the university professors. There's a crisis of trust out there. And I even saw it in my own world of music writing. And at a certain point, it dawned on me that the solution to my writing problem was identical to the solution to my business problem in China, with the difference that I had to be the honest broker. And I said, well, this is how I'm going to write from now on. I'm going to be the person people can trust. I'm going to shoot straight. I'm not going to pursue my own interest. Which in music criticism, you see people that will write something just so they can hang out with the band, or get on the jet with the Rolling Stones, or backstage pass, or whatever. Not that I was ever going to be on the plane with the Rolling Stones, but still people will do things for reasons other than speaking honestly to their reader.
Right.
Now, I recently compiled a list of all the reasons why writers will lie, and I came up with a very long list. But I decided that, like my friend said in China, you need the honest broker even here in the U.S., maybe more than ever before. So when I did finally set up my Substack, well, I'm going to call it the Honest Broker. And so that's how I became the Honest Broker.
There are 3 questions that you asked whenever you're going to publish something. Because one of the things that I've noticed that I think is rare, I think there's a lot of critics who are critical and they're sort of drab and a little cranky. And then there's a lot of people who have a sort of enthusiasm for the craft, but they sort of suck up to the artists and suck up to everybody, and then they don't have that honesty. And there's 3 questions that you ask. Is this fair? Is this accurate? Will this be persuasive to all fair-minded observers? Why those questions?
Well, absolutely. See, there's a risk writing. I guess I should call it a temptation. There are multiple temptations. One temptation is to tell the reader what they want to hear. Another temptation is to write what the editors want. Another one is to write about a musician in a favorable way so that you can become a friend. They're all, I write about something to get tenure at a university or whatever. I just put all those behind me, and I ask myself, how do I serve my reader? This is the most important thing to me, is my relationship with my reader. That's more important than if they think I'm cool or me showing off or making connections with powerful people. So what does the reader want from me? What does the reader expect from me? And the reader wants it to be honest. They want it to be fair. And obviously it has to be convincing to fair people. If I'm not operating at that level, I have failed. Now, this may seem like something every writer would do, but I think that there are a lot of writers who are, for example, they'll have some cause they want to support. So they will tilt everything in their reframing of the argument in unfair ways, not to convince fair-minded people, but to do something that almost borders on propaganda or promoting an ideology. I would suggest that maybe 50% of the writing that circulates nowadays in newsletters or articles or whatever has an agenda. And as soon as you go to the reader with an agenda, I believe the reader justifiably has an element of distrust, an element of skepticism. So I want to build that relationship of trust with the reader. It's me being the honest broker. And as that honest broker, I want them to be able to trust me.
There's an element of honesty in terms of the craft of writing, of you find yourself saying things that you're almost not supposed to say, things that maybe it's a shameful thought, maybe it's a thought that might get people angry at you. Do you find yourself having those thoughts? And when you do, what is the initial reaction like of, I just saw this honest thought that surprised me on the page, and then in your editing process, deciding whether to publish it or not, or how do I edit this sentence so that it has that fairness and that objectivity?
Well, let me take one example. Most of my writing until the last 10 years or so was music writing. I now write about a wide range of subjects, but I started out as a music writer. And probably the biggest challenge for a music writer, the biggest curse they have to overcome, is the desire to appear cool. Now, I think all writers want to appear cool. We want to be fashionable and trendy and all this. But I think music writing, especially, it tempts the writer to adopt a cool pose. So instead of speaking honestly or frankly, you try to strut and preen, and you try to act like you're too cool for school.
I mean, think of Rolling Stone.
Well, absolutely, no. And a lot of music writers became famous that way. You look at Lester Bangs, for example, Hunter Thompson, who wrote for Rolling Stone. I mean, they had an image they had to live up to. Now, you go down that path, there are all sorts of problems. You can end up maybe Hunter Thompson, or you try to live it yourself. There's a certain image people have of you, and you feel responsible to live up to the image, and now you're being untrue to yourself, I think. And I fear you end up like Hunter Thompson, you commit suicide, because the gap, as you're aging, the gap between the public's image of who you are and who you really are gets more and more painful to deal with. But in my own writing, I made a decision at a certain point that I was going to abandon the quest for coolness. And the most powerful way you can do that is to admit your own limitations to your readers. Okay.
What's an example of that?
Well, I think if you'll go through my writing, you'll see often where I will give examples where I said the wrong thing at the wrong time. One of the stories I published was how the cops came to arrest me at Stan Getz's house because I was too stupid to figure out what was going on when the alarm went off. And I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole story there, but I will deliberately subvert myself in my narratives. And I do this, it's almost the way the aesthetics will wear the hair shirt. It's a constant reminder that we may aspire to be on this level, but more often we're down at this level. And so I had to overcome a tendency, if you look at my very early writings when I was writing for my college newspaper early on, this desire to present the cool pose to the reader. It was painful to give that up. But I'm now at a point I don't even think about it. I just write from the heart. I tell things the way they happened, and I live with the consequences. But I think this actually is part of the relationship I'm trying to cultivate with the reader. Probably the best example of this now is Karl Knausgaard.
Yeah.
Who, I actually got them up on the shelf there, who wrote this Proustian autobiography, and at every step, he makes himself look as bad as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is you would think reading this, eventually you would say, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy. But actually, it's the exact opposite reaction. You say, I trust him. If he's willing to show his own frailties in such a frank, unforgiving way, I probably can trust him when he talks about other things. Now, I'm not at the level of him, because I haven't had the kind of dissipated life that I think he had. But still, I believe that's a powerful approach for a writer. I'm going to expose myself, and that gives me an opportunity to gain the trust of the reader, so I can now have this more intimate conversation, this more frank conversation with the reader.
Have you been deliberate about not trying to show off with fancy prose or crazy references? Because most people who are connoisseurs, experts to the level that you are, they use big, loquacious purple prose, and you don't. Has that been a conscious choice, or is that just more back to, I'm a straight shooter, I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to talk to people like I'm having a conversation with them at the bar?
This happened gradually and almost without my thinking about it. I had a theory of writing going back to my college days. Okay, I was reading...
You were an English major,
I was
right?
an English major, okay? I'm reading a lot of modernist literature, and I was very enamored of a literary critic named Hugh Kim, who wrote a series of books on Yeats and Pound and T.S. Eliot and all that. And he would change his writing style for each book. So if he wrote about Ezra Pound, he wrote like Ezra Pound. If he wrote about Yeats, he wrote like Yeats. He would adopt something of the persona of the author he was writing about in his own prose. And I liked that. And so when I started writing about music, every book I wrote had a different prose style.
How does one write like jazz?
Well, for example, I wrote a book called West Coast Jazz. And it is sort of a hip, cool thing, and the prose is very flashy. It's about life in Hollywood and the movie studios and all that. And so I will use more flamboyant language, more flamboyant metaphors. The adjectives will be more striking. Then I write a book about the Delta blues. So now I'm in Mississippi, and now I want to write more like Faulkner, and all the metaphors have to do with the soil and the crops. And the way I structure the sentences becomes lazier, more relaxed, and open. So every book I wrote, I tried to change the style.
Lazier, relaxed, open. What does that actually look like in a way a sentence is formed?
Well, what I will compare things to the shape of the leaves of trees or the flow of the river. There are elements of Faulkner that will come into it. And for example, when I'm writing about the Delta blues, I read great books by Mississippi authors,
right,
trying to capture some of that. And so you look at just the opening page of my Delta blues book, you'll see this is totally unlike the West Coast Jazz book. Okay, now let's fast forward to what you were just asking, how I write now. I launched my Substack newsletter 3.5 years ago. And I just continued to write the way I would write music criticism for a magazine or a newspaper. But I found that my prose started changing on its own without me even being aware of it. It became more conversational. Now, why did this happen? When I got on Substack, one of the people there, Dan Stone, told me, he said, Ted, when you write on Substack, you have a different relationship with your reader. People are getting emails from you. Your readers are getting emails from you several times a week. They feel they know you personally. So don't be surprised if readers start contacting you and acting as if you're longtime friends, because this is the nature of writing on Substack. And what I found was, without even me thinking about it, I started writing on Substack the way I would have a conversation like with you. Or let's say I go out with a friend to dinner, just the two of us, and the banter back and forth we would have, that's exactly how I started writing on Substack. It's very conversational. And the funny thing was, I didn't plan it that way. It just felt natural. You know, like I say, I try to adapt my writing to what is right in that particular setting. And without me doing a lot of strategizing on it, I started writing in a more direct conversational manner. Now that makes it very awkward to show off. I mean, if I wanted to show off and quote Shakespeare or whatever, this is Plato, Aristotle, Dante, the Substack is not the place to do it. But there is one thing I do is I will often, in the course of my writing on Substack, I will throw away something in an aside or a subsidiary phrase that includes a very arcane literary reference or philosophical reference that just a few of my readers will get. And I know that for them, they will find that very entertaining. It's not me showing off. It's just sort of like a fun thing I do for the few readers that will do it. So, for example, I will say, I was listening to this music and it awoke me from my dogmatic slumber, which was what Immanuel Kant said when he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason.
Sure. He
had read David Hume, and David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. So I'll put that in, and I know that of my readers, 1 out of 1,000 will get that reference, but it will entertain that reader. And then there are other ones where I'll do something from a song lyric or whatever. So there's on the surface, my writing now looks very straightforward and direct, but there are layers within it. And the person who has the more arcane knowledge will get things from it that others that just operate at the surface level won't get.
Sure. You're now writing a book on Substack. So tell me about, I think you've published like 10 chapters out of 12.
That's right.
So how has that experience been different? You're almost done with the book. How has it been different from the other books that you've published without that direct relationship, that quick feedback with your readers?
Well, I was working on a book when I got on Substack. It's called Music to Raise the Dead. And it's about this extraordinary tradition in music going back thousands of years where music has this transcendental power. I mean, literally to raise people from the dead. If you remember the myth of Orpheus, Orpheus's wife dies. He has to go down to the underworld and bring his wife back to life by playing the lyre. So he's making music, and Hades, the head of the underworld, is so charmed by the music, he let him bring his wife back to life. And this myth exists all over the world. There are 50 or 100 Native American tribes that have the identical myth. Now, obviously, they weren't reading ancient Greek mythology, and it's linked to shamanism, where the shaman goes into a trance,
right,
has certain songs and rhythms, is able to get to an alternative state of being, and that has magical powers. And so this is the whole purpose of the book. And I was writing this book, and then I got on Substack, and I thought, I'm just going to publish this book on Substack. Now, that's not easy to do because people generally don't look to email newsletters for books, but I made sure each section that I published was self-contained. So you could read this installment, and even if you hadn't read the previous chapters, you could still read any chapter in isolation and it still worked. And so I've been doing that, and it's a little more elaborate than the stuff I would normally put on Substack. It has less of that conversational tone. It's got footnotes, and it's a huge amount of scholarly apparatus there. But still, I think my readers appreciate that. And also, I like the idea of taking a book and bringing it directly to my reader without the intermediary of an editor or publisher, which is one of my goals in life, is to have that direct relationship with the reader. If I can do it for a newsletter, why not for a book?
You're talking about the shamans who've had the music memorized, and that was the way that music was shared. I mean, I think of the bards in ancient Greece with the Odyssey and the Iliad. How does songwriting change after the invention of typography to what we're getting to now? How is songwriting fundamentally different from what we got back then?
Well, I think there were certain changes and shifts in musical culture, and I think they also apply to writing, especially poetry. And I think the biggest shift actually happened about 2,500 years ago, and I call this the Pythagorean rupture. That's a fancy term. Now, what do I mean by the Pythagorean rupture?
Yeah, what do you mean
by that? What I
that?
mean is, up until the time of Pythagoras, now he was an ancient Greek philosopher, and most of us know him through geometry because he had the Pythagorean theorem,
right,
which I vaguely recall in the deep recesses of my head. But Pythagoras also was the first person to understand how to tune instruments and the mathematical ratios in tuning. And he found if you had a string and you had a note, and then you changed the length of the string, it changes the note, and he worked out all the proportions, and he created the first true guide to musical modes or scales in history. Now, what happened, though, is before Pythagoras, music was very magical. You'd fall into a trance, you'd have divine experiences, you'd have tutelary spirits, you'd have shamans that could cure people, and the music would empower them. After Pythagoras, music stopped being magical, it became mathematical. And one of the key focuses of my vocation as a music writer is to recapture the magic of music. And the same thing is true of poetry. I mean, poetry was a magical invocation. The first thing you did as a poet is you thanked the muse. The muse inspired you, the goddess. The goddess inspired your writing. What an amazing concept that is. And we lose that now. One of the few people in modern times who believed that was the writer Robert Graves, who was a novelist and wrote a lot of very successful books, but he wrote a book called The White Goddess. He believed that there was a muse, it was a goddess that inspired his work. And so for me, there are ruptures like that, the Pythagorean one, and then when you talk about what you just did is people writing music down on paper. That's the ultimate extension of that. Music now is no longer magical sound. It's not even sound. It's written on a piece of paper. And I know in my own studies of the aesthetics of music, I had philosophers tell me that, well, the real music, Ted, isn't the song, it's the musical score.
This relates to songwriting, but I had dinner with a musician a few months ago, and he got to be in the studio with Kanye West as they were writing some songs. And I said, what was that like? He said, they did something really interesting. What they did was they wrote, air quotes, wrote, by going around and they would basically throw out different lyrics. And somebody in the room tried to write something down and they're like, do not write it down. Do not write it down. And he's like, why? And it was Kanye or somebody else said, we do not write things down in the moment. We let the moment flow and we let our memories remember. And then we remember only the best lines and then we write those down after. And I think that that's an interesting blend of the two things they were saying. I know that that doesn't have to do with Pythagorean notation, but there is a similarity there. It's not sitting and writing. It's sort of freestyling, letting something go, and then remembering things later on and keeping that.
And this makes perfect sense. And I think a lot of writers are like this. The magic of writing is so uncontrollable. You get an inspiration. Where does it come from? And once you have experiences where these things come to you, you worry, is it going to go away? I know songwriters, this is a huge fear, is that the song came to them. Often it comes fully formed. Just as in a moment, the song just seems to create itself. I know in my own music career, the highest level of me playing jazz, and I worked for many years as a jazz pianist, is that moment when the music seems to be playing itself. And you're almost watching yourself do it. How am I doing this? And as soon as you start thinking about it, you make a mistake. And as soon as your conscious mind comes in, and I know the same thing happens in writing. Now, writing is a much more methodical thing, but still that same situation arises. And so when you get that inspiration, like the story you've just told, you're very careful with it. Don't write it down. You try to hold on to it. And I know I collect bits of wisdom from people who've had moments of inspiration. And here's a great story. This came to me from John Handy, who was a saxophonist who early in his career worked with the great jazz bassist and composer Charles Mingus.
Okay.
In fact, he was on an album called Mingus and some people will tell you justifiably this is one of the 5 or 10 greatest jazz albums of all time. And I remember the first time I saw John Handy, I played that album. He said, that's me. I'm playing that part. You wanted to make sure that I knew that he was playing the parts on this because it's such an amazing achievement to be one of the great jazz albums of all time. And years later, I had an opportunity to produce a record of his. So I worked as a record producer. And here's a great story he had where he was playing with Charles Mingus and he's playing a sax solo one night. And it's just inspired. And the notes are coming. He has no idea where they're coming from, but the audience is just loving it. They're screaming, they're cheering, they're clapping. When he's done, the audience is just blown away. They'd never heard anything like that. And Charles Mingus, his boss, the bassist, calls him over and tells him, John, don't ever do that again. Now, what's going on there? Now, what John Handy said is his immediate reaction was, the boss is jealous of me. I just did something that was so exciting that I became the center of attention, and now he doesn't want me to do that. But he said it only occurred to him later what Charles Mingus really meant. What he really said was, you had a moment of inspiration there where you did something. You were totally in the moment. Don't try to play that exact same thing tomorrow night.
Huh. Now I see what you're saying.
You got this idea, and now tomorrow night, instead of being fresh and open to the experience, and in the moment again, you're going to try to recreate what you did 24 hours ago or a week ago or a month ago or a year ago. So when he told John Handy, don't do that again, he wasn't saying, I'm jealous of you because you did something great. He says, I want you to do great things again in the future, but the only way you can do that is being open to the immediacy of the experience right there.
You know, it is striking. If you talk to film directors, they'll say, there was something about the 17th take that was just perfect. It was just perfect. And we did 18, 19, 20. We'll never be able to recreate that. And I feel that with writing. I will show up. I'll have the same cup of coffee. I'll sit in the exact same place. I'll sleep the exact same amount. Everything will be the same. But there's something on some day where something comes out. And then I will look at that piece of writing and I will say, I don't really feel like I made that. Do you feel that?
I believe this is a common experience of creative people, especially when you're operating at your best. And I write every day. I write every day. And I have a list of articles to write or whatever. And I'll sit down and I'll work on something. But every once in a while, you'll just start writing and it will seem to have a life of its own.
Totally.
And I've heard novelists tell me this, is that the characters start doing things you didn't ask them to do. You know, the character starts imposing their will on the author. The character says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But even in my nonfiction writing, I feel that this writing has a life of its own. It has a direction it's going to go, and I have to trust that.
Well, there's a moment in creative work where when you start off, at least for me, and not every project's the same, but often I have a vision for where I want to take the piece, and I'm leading it. And then there's a moment when the piece takes on a life of its own, and I am now in response, in service of the piece, almost a custodian of the intrinsic telos that piece now has.
Absolutely. And this is a valuable lesson. The thing that helped me enormously with all the years of me playing jazz piano, because in jazz, there is a culture that prizes improvisation.
Right, of course.
And if there are two paths you can go, and one is keep doing it over and over the same way to get it perfect, or to do it every different every time you do it differently to try to capture something spontaneously. Then, as a jazz musician, you're supposed to do it the second way. Now, I know jazz musicians who do play the same solo every night. They get up there, and it's time for the sax solo, and it's exactly the same the way they did it the previous night. Within the jazz community, those people are derided and scorned.
I'm not surprised.
Now, you wouldn't say it publicly, but you say, this is not the spirit of the music. If you start playing it the same way, the funny thing is sometimes it sounds very spontaneous. And then you'll go to you'll sit around and you'll hear the next concert. It's the same. And so I very early in my jazz vocation, which came to me before my writing vocation, music to me, I was a musician before I really became serious as a writer. And I got this idea of just trusting the spontaneity and not try to force anything and to let it come to me. That's helped me enormously as a writer. And so now I do this almost as an extreme. I will write things, and some of the stuff I write is pretty strange. I mean, if you read my newsletter, it's unusual, but this is the only way I know how to work, is to let myself take chances. That's the only way I can get up to that level. You know, I have to, if I just tried to do it by rote and routine and formula, I could get up there maybe consistently. But if I want to get up to that higher level, I've got to take risks, and this is how I do it.
Yeah, that shows up all the time in your work. What is it about formula that you just loathe and despise so much?
It's true, and I often get into interviews, and people say, why don't you like the Marvel movies, or why don't... And these are just formula.
You hate formula.
I hate formulas. I hate formula. And I'm almost extreme. So, for example, my wife and I will watch movies, and I'll say, I don't want to know... Listen, I think I hate most is when the movie or TV series starts. Within the first 5 minutes, I already know how it's going to turn out.
Sure.
Well, this is the hero, that's the villain, the hero will triumph the villain. And you just, when you know that, there's no interest to me. I love movies or books or TV series where they completely disrupt my expectations. That's what's fun for me, is to have something that completely disrupts my expectations, that sends like this energy through my body. And so I am the enemy of the formula, but I don't think it's unjustified. I believe a lot of the crises we have in the culture now are driven by too heavy a reliance on formulas. I mean, Hollywood is struggling now. Disney had a miserable quarter, and they haven't had a huge hit movie this year. Paramount has been struggling. That last Mission Impossible film was not as lucrative as they thought. Exciting movie, but still the box office receipts fell flat. And you look at all the movies, last year we had a bit of a blip with Barbie and Oppenheimer, but if you look at the monthly trend, and I've analyzed like a 6-month moving average, it's downward. There's a complete lack of excitement among the movie audience, and it's because the studios relied too much on formula.
So when you say that we need to move beyond formula, are you saying what we need to do is like the Beatles, where every single album sort of gets better and it actually changes and evolves over time, and then that creates a change in the culture from like 63 to 68? Or are you saying like, no, we need more Bohemian Rhapsody in the world, where it's like one song, but it's like actually 7, 8 different songs, Mamma Mia, Mamma Mia, it's like all of that. What are you saying?
I'm saying all of those.
Okay.
All of those and more. Let 1,000 flowers blossom. The Beatles are a great example. They're a great example because, and some Beatles fans are going to get angry at me, but I will say it outright. I love the Beatles, but when they were first signed to a record contract, those songs were not very sophisticated. I mean, I think George Martin, the producer, said, I brought these boys from Liverpool, and the best thing they could come up was Love Me Do. And he said he was completely disappointed in the quality of their songwriting early on. But they got better and better. At every album, they took more chances. And finally, they got to a point where every album was a fundamentally different experience than the previous album. And what this did was, and this was marvelous, is it reinvigorated the whole music culture, because the Beatles were so successful. All the other bands and record labels were trying to imitate them, but they couldn't keep up. So they came out with a TV show with the Monkees. And the Monkees came on TV in the mid-'60s, and they captured the Beatles sound as it had been the previous 6 months. But by the time the show actually shows up on TV, the Beatles are already on to the next thing. And this shook up the music culture, and you had a period of several years in which the music changed every few months. And the record labels would give their artists a lot of creative freedom because they realized that if we are going to keep up with what the Beatles are doing and the fast pace of change in popular music, we need to give our most creative people more freedom. Nowadays, we have the exact opposite of that. And I'll talk about music, but the same thing I think is true of a lot of writing. If you listen to the radio now, you listen to the hit songs today, a hip-hop song, a country song, a pop song, and imagine if they had been on the radio 20 years ago, what would you think? Well, they would have fit in 20 years ago. They really would.
You know, this is a striking thing about country music. It seems to me that it's very stagnant. I'm no country music connoisseur, but I'll give you one data point, sort of the only one I have. But I graduated from college in 2016, so it's been the better part of a decade. And I can turn on the Sirius XM country music, the highway, and I know the words to about half the songs, and I basically haven't listened to country music in 10 years.
Well, the songs are staying on the radio for longer. There's a shift to people listening to old songs instead of new songs. And when the new songs come out, they're very similar to the old ones. Now, why is this happening? I don't think it's happening for creative reasons. I don't think it's happening because it's the most artistic or aesthetically pleasing or satisfying thing. It's happening for economic, commercial reasons and because the companies are not risk takers. So this gets back to my unhappiness with the formula. It's very difficult to come out with something creative or fresh because the system will shut you down. The system will shut you down. This is the hypocrisy of the record labels and the publishers in that what they say doesn't match their actions. What they say is, we're looking for fresh talent. We're looking for writers with a different voice and a different perspective. But I'm being cynical here, but I believe this is true. The reality is, sitting in those publishing offices in New York, the reality is, what was on the bestseller list last week? We want exactly that. So like when Harry Potter books come out, we want a boy wizard.
Yeah. Well, to this point, I'm just tired of that same nonfiction formula of here's my point, here's an anecdote, here's a study, and then we sort of summarize the point, and you just do that over and over and over. I just find the best-selling books that you would find at the front table at Barnes & Noble to be very formulaic in that way. And when I talk to my friends who are writing books, working with publishers, the word that comes to mind, I don't know why, it's like it's squashing the individuality.
I'm going to write about this in the future about the culture's flattening. The culture is flattening. But this is why I write directly for the reader. And I don't want to sound overly cynical, but it was so frustrating dealing with the publishing industry in the U.S. right now, particularly the major publishers. There's such a narrow range of things they want, and it all changes based on what's fashionable. So Pirates of the Caribbean they want pirate stories. And you give them the pirate story, and they say, well, this week it's sword-fighting hillbillies. Can you do a sword-fighting? Okay, I'll do a sword-fighting. It feels like they're chasing each other, and they're chasing their tail. And it becomes very stultifying. It becomes very banal. I believe the liberation in our culture is going to be risk-taking, which is probably going to happen on the grassroots level.
Of course.
You know, I can do it on Substack because I don't have to answer to a corporate boss. I don't even take advertisers. I don't have sponsors or patrons. I please the readers, the relationship with the reader, and the reader understands day one that TED takes chances. Mm-hmm. You probably read that article I did the other day of introducing, because I picked up, my subscription base has grown 30% in the last 10 weeks.
I saw that.
So I had to integrate my new readers into my newsletter. So I said, welcome on board. I'm happy to have you here. The first thing you need to know is to expect the unexpected. So I have the reader, they understand that I can take chances. And you can do that in the microculture now. You can do that in what you do. I can do it in what I do. If you have a YouTube channel, you can do it. If you self-produce your albums on Bandcamp, you can do it. As soon as you start working within the mainstream publishing industry, particularly the major publishers, my experience, and maybe other people have better experiences than me, but my experience is the range of writing they want has become tremendously narrowed and predictable and formulaic. And if we're going to get something fresh and exciting, it's going to happen not under their watch. It's going to happen bubbling up from the microculture.
When Kevin Kelly was running the Whole Earth catalog with Stuart Brand, I think it was, I might get the fraction wrong, but I think that their goal was to alienate 1/5 of the readership. They said 1/5 was roughly right, because if it's any more, then you haven't pissed off enough people, but if it's any less, then you're probably not speaking to your audience. It really stuck with me.
That's great. Stuart Brand is a hero of mine. Now, I haven't heard that, but that's great. And in fact, when people get upset at me, I often consider that positive.
Sure. I love that idea.
And I don't look to make enemies, but if you are going to make enemies, make the right kind of enemies, is what I say. And so I won't, when I criticize Marvel movies, like Martin Scorsese found this. He criticized the Marvel movies, saying we need more risk-taking in Hollywood. A lot of people get angry at him. Less so lately, though. I think as people see the box office fall off, even some of the fans of those movies are getting frustrated by the formulas. But I believe this is the single biggest risk and opportunity in our culture, is to fight through the formulas and to create something that's truly different, something that's like a new counterculture. I have every expectation that we are going to get something that's more like a new counterculture. It's in the process of being formed right now. There are now internet platforms to allow it. And it's just a question of it all coming together and cohering.
I thought this was interesting advice for writers. You can pop in whenever you want. I'm just going to talk through it. Buy a blank journal and keep it in a safe place. You don't want anybody to see what you write in it. Then, at the end of each day, put down what happened during the last 24 hours. But there's one unbreakable rule. What you write in the journal must be absolutely and totally honest.
Well, and I've got to say, you're quoting from something I wrote. I took this from somebody else. The problem is I don't remember who I heard this from. So I've got to say up front, I believe this. I can't take total credit from it. Somebody told me this years ago.
It's great advice.
And what they said was, people say, I don't know what to write about. I want to be a writer, but I don't know what to write about, or I don't have any good ideas. This was the best advice. Take a journal. Every day you write stuff that's brutally honest. And you can't show it to anybody because everyone will get angry if they just, but if anything irritated you during the day or something happened you didn't like, or you saw something, well, they shouldn't do it this way, they should do it that way. And what happens is you write that down every day. And after you've done about 30 days of this, you go back and you read it. And you say, where did these ideas come from? Where did this fresh, risk-taking writer I didn't know I had this stuff in me. But it was only by giving myself permission to break the rules that I could do it. Now, let me explain why this is true. I'm going to get a little scientific on you, so be forgiving of this. Let's look at the theory of evolution. Okay? And supposedly, according to the theory of evolution, people get better and better all the time. But in fact, what evolution has done is not taught us to be honest, but taught us to fit in. Because the survival of the fittest is the person who fits in. Like if you're a child and your family moves, you go to a new school, and you're thrown with all these other kids. What's your goal? Well, I want to fit in. You're drafted into the army. You're with all these soldiers. Well, I want to fit in. I don't want to make waves. This is how you succeed in the world. So there's this evolutionary tendency for people have to choose being honest or saying what will help them fit in. People are rewarded for fitting in. So this is why we have groupthink. This is why we have formulas.
And there's a Girardian component with imitation, too.
Absolutely. Peter, you are absolutely. Renee Girard said there's a tendency for people to imitate, and this has been programmed into us biologically because we survive if we fit in. Now, I'm going back to writing now, and this writing advice I just gave, this is why you need to unteach yourself everything you've done to fit in and be part of the groupthink. You have to give yourself permission to be honest because society will not give you that permission. 99% of the situations you are in society will reward you for adapting to other people's expectations. And that doesn't create greatness as a writer. So the only way you can get to this higher level as a writer is you must give yourself permission to go against the evolutionary tendency, the need to fit in, the groupthink, the Girardian mimetic thing of imitation, and speak honestly from your heart. But you have to teach yourself that.
I mean, you use the word give yourself permission. I almost want to use a more active verb there. You need to push yourself. It's more than permission. You need to propel yourself into a place of discomfort. We're almost squiggling and squealing of, I'm not comfortable saying this. And that's why the journaling in private is so important.
Absolutely. And there's another thing I will say is that it takes time. And this is where the more experience you have with the world and comfort and confidence in yourself, you're better able to speak with that honesty. This is hard to do when you're young. I give advice to my sons. I say, this is your very difficult situation. You're constantly in settings where conformity and fitting in are inculcated, and it's difficult to speak up and say, this is what I believe. But that does get easier over time. So this is in many creative pursuits, you worry that as you age, you're going to lose it because the young have all this, their neurons are firing much faster and all that. But there is an advantage if you've led a life and you've built a sense of confidence in who you are and a mastery over difficult situations. You've had experiences that were tough. You got to the other side of them. You put yourself outside your comfort zone and you flourished. That aids us when we get to this point where we're going to write honestly. Because finally, I know who I am. I know what I believe, and now I know what I'm going to say.
You were talking about conformity, and when I was reading your 50 quotes, you quoted Romans 12:2, one of my favorites. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Why'd you choose that, and how does it show up in your life?
That's a great quote.
It's so good.
It's
so good.
Because the pattern of this world is not something that you can put your anchor on.
Yeah.
And what you see is that there's always a flavor of the month and a flavor of the week or the thing happening now. And if you try to build on that, it collapses because those things never survive. And so you must seek out the timeless. And you must renew your mind on the timeless truths. And that's why, I spent a lot of time with these old books, is because this is my firmer anchor. And I was very extreme when I was young. You're gonna find this ridiculous. I had a professor once who taught me Milton and Dante and medieval and Renaissance literature, and he told me once, Ted, I don't read any book written after 1900 because it hasn't proven itself yet. The funny thing is, I was like that for a long time. Now, maybe I was like 1940 or 1950, but I had this idea that I didn't want to invest in a book until it had proven its benefits to generations of readers. Now, I'm not as much a stickler on that now. I read a lot of new books, but still, I believed if something has given wisdom to generations of readers for hundreds and hundreds of years, I should open myself up to that experience.
Well, I saw you say read old books when you're young and younger books when you're old. What's going on with that?
Absolutely. That's what I did that for music and literature. And this is the exact opposite of what most people do.
The exact opposite.
Most people, like in music, when they're young, they listen to the new music. And as they get older, they still listen to the old music because they're still hearkening back to when they were young. And what I did with my reading and the music I consumed when I was younger is I wanted to understand the tradition. And so, for example, I felt I could not understand a contemporary novel at the level I wanted to until I had read 300, 400, 500 of the classic novels of the past. There was a point when I was younger, a big newspaper asked me to review a contemporary novel. And I just looked at it and said, I don't know how to do this. I haven't completed my education yet. Finally, by the time I got into my 40s, I was well read. I had read the classics, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the spiritual literatures, the novels, the poems, the epics. I had the philosophy, the history. Finally, I had that grasp. I said, now I can focus on what's happening today and have a perspective on it.
Sure.
So I started reading contemporary fiction around age 45. In my 40s, I started listening just to new music, for the most part. I listen to 80% new music now. When I was younger, it was 80% old music. This makes no sense to most people, but to me, it's been very valuable because now I can look at something happening today, in the culture today, and I have this foundation of why this connects back to what Shakespeare did, or what Aristotle said, or what the ancient Greeks did in their tragedies. This is the way I view culture. And so I will look at something like Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
And I'll say, well, finally somebody's done a TV show that's like ancient Greek tragedy. Well, what do you mean? I said, well, all the other TV shows, the main character is static and acts the same as season 1, season 2, season 3, season 4, whatever. But Walter White starts as a basically good person. He's a science teacher, high school. But he's got cancer. He needs to pay his medical bills. And out of desperation, what he does is he starts selling drugs. But even then, he just wants to do the science part of it. He has his buddy Jesse does the selling because Walter White is a pure person with pure motives. And then you watch gradually over the series of several seasons, he becomes an evil person, becomes a criminal because he has a tragic flaw, which is this desire for self-aggrandizement that had been negated in the world. He had tried to do a startup and it failed. He'd been forced to do teaching. And now his tragic flaw leads to his final collapse. And so I say, well, finally somebody has done a TV series that draws on the wisdom of the ancient Greek tragedy. That's why this thing is so successful. None of the other TV series are doing it. So this is how I view culture now, how I view writing, how I view narrative, how I view storytelling, is this larger perspective.
Walk me through two things. The first is tactically what you did in your teens, 20s, 30s, so that by the time you were 45, you had that education. So what did that look like on a day-by-day basis? And then the other thing, then we can get into what do you do on a day-by-day basis in terms of where writing fits on your schedule, then focused reading in the chair upstairs, and then just listening to music.
Okay, and I got to say up front, I don't talk about this often. And because what I did was so extreme. And I say it's like an extreme sport. What I did with my education was like somebody trying to climb Mount Everest or whatever. I want to, and I'm not telling other people to do this. I'm not holding myself up as a role model. I'm not saying everybody has to do this, and I'm not showing off or whatever. But I'll tell you what I did myself. Provided the proviso is this was me doing something sort of like an extreme sport level of discipline.
Sure.
Starting in high school, I would get up at 5:30 in the morning to read for an hour or so before going to school. I wanted to have enough time to have breakfast and shower and shave, whatever. But I also a huge chunk of time every morning to read before going to school. And this would not be books assigned in school. This is always beyond school. Okay. So this became part of my pattern throughout life. It's easier to do that in an educational institution. But when I got jobs, it was hard. I had some very demanding jobs, but if I had to give up sleep, so I wasn't getting enough sleep, but I still could get up early and do my reading regimen.
You would?
I would. This was important. And I wouldn't be a slacker. So for example, my first really demanding job was with the Boston Consulting Group. And this is a high-powered job. Back then, they only had about 340 consultants in the world. So you went into that job, you are advising Fortune 500 CEOs. Now, it's ridiculous to consider me advising Fortune 500 CEOs when I'm in my early 20s. And this is a scary thought. But the reality was I was thrust into this high-powered job, but still every morning before I went to the office, I would drive over to the Stanford campus because I was living in Palo Alto. I'd go into Trusted or Union, I'd bring a stack of books. And these were the most difficult. This is when I read Sartre's Being and Nothing.
Sure.
So, these were the most demanding books I could find. And I wanted to force myself out of this analytical business mindset, this commercial mindset. I needed something as an antidote to that. And then when the day was done, I would drive back to Stanford. I'd find a practice room and I'd play the piano. Then I'd go. I didn't own a TV back then. I didn't own a TV until I was in my mid-30s because I wanted to have time for reading, listening to music, music making. But I've continued this. I've done this for 50 years now. And even now, people view me as a writer, and I am a writer. I'm a productive writer, but I don't start writing till the afternoon. The whole morning is devoted to listening to music and reading, and mostly reading books. And I will, later in the day, I'll read articles or whatever, but I'll read books, and they're demanding books, and the books are always designed to be mind expanding. So I've now done this for 50 years, and it's given me a great grasp of things. And I will say that I did not do this as a career strategy. I didn't do this to make money or anything. Obviously, I didn't do it to make money. The funny thing is, around the time I got into my 40s, it had an impact. I would speak, and people would respond to my speaking in surprising ways. I had a certain authority. I had a certain gravitas. People took me very seriously. And I could only conclude this was the cumulative result of this arduous education I had imposed upon myself, had given me an authority in people's eyes. And it wasn't like I was trying to show off. I wasn't quoting Plato or Shakespeare or whatever, but there was somehow this education had seeped into me and had so permeated my mind and my communication skills, the way I would construct sentences, the way I would try to present an argument. And all of a sudden, people wanted to hire me now for all sorts of projects. Ted, we want you to help us raise money for our business. We want you to do this, that, or the other. And the funny thing was that this education, which I had not done for the slightest commercial reasons, did prove to be a vocational skill. And even now, it's a vocational skill. But it only works if you pursue it disinterestedly, because the payoff is so long in coming. You could never actually do this as a conscious career strategy. You have to have a love of learning and a love of immersing yourself in these works, and then you will get benefits.
The other thing that stands out is you have written about jazz, then music, but not just reading the musical canon, reading all over the place. How then have books about, say, finance, like The Alchemy of Finance by George Soros, how have those influenced how you see culture and how you see music, how you see writing, how you see the world changing now?
That was another pure coincidence. And if you're open to experiences, coincidence and chance will play a great role in your life, could be a very positive role. But let's go back to this period when I talked about The Honest Broker, where I'm doing projects all over the world. I was 30 countries and 5 continents. I'm doing on-the-ground projects. These are very business-oriented projects.
I saw you needed to get more pages in your passport.
No, actually, I did.
Yeah.
I actually ran out of pages in my passport. I was traveling so much. I had to send it back to the State Department to put more pages in. And I was expected to do many things, but I was supposed to analyze situations first and foremost and predict the future. How will this product launch go? How will this technology evolve? What are consumer attitudes going to be now versus 5 years from now? And people were constantly hiring me to predict the future. So this became a specialty of mine. I became what you'd call a futurist. And it was only at a late stage I began applying this to my writing. I remember I was writing the Delta Blues, and I ran into an argument about whether the blues had been an innovation or the retention of an old tradition. And I said, well, actually, what I studied in product launches can help me here. The product launches taught me that innovation happens in densely populated areas. When I studied product launches in business, we used these formulas to predict, and the formulas all came out in the medical literature to predict the spread of disease. And so what I found was innovation happens most rapidly in the same kind of settings that create the spread of disease. densely populated areas where people of different cultures come together.
I couldn't believe some of the similarities between the island of Lesbos in ancient Greece and New Orleans.
Absolutely. So this is a classic example. Why did jazz come out of New Orleans? Because New Orleans was a densely populated city. It was a very medically dangerous city with
Super diverse.
With diverse population. Then I got to the blues, which came in the middle of nowhere, in the most rural areas where there was no intermixing of people. And I said, well, it's obvious, drawing upon what I studied for product launches and predicting the future in business, that the blues was not an innovation, it was the retention of an old tradition. And because it was in an isolated place, it stayed alive. Because if a blues musician had gone to New York or Chicago, they would have forgotten the blues. It's only because they were in isolated rural areas they could retain traditions going back to Africa. So this was the first time in my life where I was studying music and culture, and an analytical technique I had used in Silicon Valley helped me understand it. Now, since then, I've done this increasingly, where I study what's happening in books, I'm happening in movies, music, and I use all these analytical techniques. So that's why I will read a book by George Soros called The Alchemy of Finance, where he shows how he became a billionaire by understanding the way financial markets, especially currency markets, would evolve. And this is why I will study all these people that have developed analytical tools. I was just reading Ray Dalio's book. He's trying to predict what's going to happen in investments, but I can apply that to culture. This is why I learned from Rene Girard, because Rene Girard got the idea that led to the first investment in Facebook, because the idea is that people imitate each other. Facebook is a great investment because now you can benchmark your imitation against your neighbors. So what I've done is I've drawn on all these analytical techniques that normally a music writer would never worry about. But I had been forced to do this to earn a living. To earn a living, I had been forced to find ways to predict the future. I'm doing it now. I'm just applying it to music, writing, movies, and culture, not to new products.
I always like to think, like, if I'm listening to this, what does this mean for my writing? And there's two takeaways that I'm getting. One of them is, what is the skill that you have that is highly distinctive from the other people in your space? So one of the things that you have from your MBA background, BCG, is the ability to analyze an S1. So you can look at what's happening at Universal Music Group and Spotify and actually break down what's going on there. That's the first thing. How do I become uncorrelated to my competition, so to speak? And then the other thing is that becoming a good writer can begin with deep domain expertise. And so often we think of, I'm going to learn the craft, I'm going to learn about adverbs and all the schoolhouse rock stuff that we learn in 4th and 5th grade. But what you're saying is it begins with the expertise, build up that large corpus of knowledge, and then you can begin to cross-pollinate ideas that are in your head.
That's absolutely true. Not long ago, I was visiting a college campus. And when I go there, they often have me give a lecture on music. They have me sit in on music classes. But at one of them, they said, we want you to talk to a classroom of writers. So I'd love to talk to writers. I have a lot of things to tell them. One of the things I told them was, if you want to be a writer, you must also become an expert in something.
Right.
For example, I know people that went to law school. They leave law school, they decide to become a sports writer. Then they see all these sports writers, these athletes are getting arrested. And they're the only person in the newsroom that, I know the law, I'm the president. The fact that they studied law makes them a more effective sports reporter. I bet if you knew the law, you'd be a great music writer too, because every week some musician is getting arrested on some charge. But there's 1,000 ways where if you have some expertise other than just writing,
right,
it will make you a more powerful writer because you will have perspectives on the world. Now, I stumbled upon one pathway where I learned business, I learned analytics, I learned how to read a financial statement, I learned how to anticipate trends, and then I applied it to culture writing. But you could do that in 100 other ways. And so I told them, I said, if you want to be a writer, you should also find 1 or 2 areas in which you know more than the other writers. And that will give you perspectives, it will give you things to write about, it will empower you. Now, I'm old enough now where I have a bunch of these things in my back pocket. There's the reading I've done and my self-education, my work as a musician, stuff I did in Silicon Valley. I draw upon all of it now. And I view everything I know, everything I've learned, everything I've experienced helps. The one problem that's endemic right now is most writers, if they work, the only place they work is at a college teaching writing.
Right.
And that gives you a certain range of experiences, but they should try to cultivate other experiences outside of that, because just being a teacher, although it's a very valuable and commendable vocation, will only get you so far. You need to have experiences beyond that if you want to continue to rise and develop as a writer.
One of the things that I've also picked up is a real appreciation for taking notes. So you'll read a book and you're just showing me, for example, Hegel's Phenomenology, and you were showing, underlining the sentences, making little margins. But the thing that really stuck out was your reconstruction of different sources. So you finish the book, presumably, and then you say, I'm going to reconstruct this, put this into my own words. Not just that, but also handwriting different paragraphs, different sentences that really resonate with you. So what's going on there? Why do you do that?
I originally did that handwriting. Now I often go directly to the computer. You've seen where I sit and read.
Yeah.
Literally, it's 5 feet away from my desk where my computer is. So I was reading Hegel, for example, and he says something there about the ancient Greek culture flourished because of its heterogeneity. Okay? That ancient Greece was known as being welcoming to foreigners, and this was one of the powerful things that set it apart and made it the center of European culture for a while. And I'm thinking, well, this fits in with my writings on diversity. The diversity is empowering to a culture. Now, Hegel uses the word heterogeneity, not diversity, but it's very interesting. So I just put the book down, I walk over to the computer, and I start writing, and after I've written a few paragraphs, I save the file, and I go back and start reading again. But to me, this interactive process between reading and writing is very powerful.
It's consumption and synthesis.
Absolutely.
Boom, 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 boom.
I could not write at the level I do if I didn't have a constant intake of new ideas and new perspectives. This is why I don't start writing till I have read a big chunk every day, because the reading is like fuel in the tank. I read articles, I read books. I'm constantly trying to get new ideas into my head. And everybody should do this. And this is the flaw in our culture, because people go to work and the boss measures them on their output. The boss should measure their input too. And the bosses don't ask that. The boss wants to know, what did you do today? What was your output? They don't say, what movies did you see? What books are you reading? What magazines do you read? What newspaper do you read? The boss doesn't ask that, but the boss really should. There is no field in which your input doesn't help your output. If I was a cook working in the diner, the more I learn about food, the stronger I am. Anything I do, if I am doing repairs, the more I know about machinery, the stronger I am. If I am driving an Uber, the better I know the streets and the maps, the stronger I am. There is no field of endeavor in which your input does not empower your output. I take this to an extreme. I make sure I spend more time per day on my input than my output. But honestly, I could not work at the level I do if I wasn't obsessive about this. So I know I seem compulsive, but there's a method to my madness because this is how I write.
You spoke a little bit about Proust earlier, but do you ever read for style, or is it mostly for the content and the information?
Oh, I love people that write with a great style. So Proust is great at that. I love Henry James, especially the late James, Dostoevsky, Susan Sontag, Joan Didion, Isaiah Berlin, the intellectual historian. Sometimes I'll give you an example. I don't even like the book, but I like the writing style.
I love that.
This is a classic example. Years ago, I thought, well, you know how I like to read big books?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. And I'm reading it, and at a certain point, I find that after I'm about 1,500 pages into it, I realize I don't agree with this guy. This guy was one of the exponents of the Age of Reason, And he's trying to explain everything in this ultra-rationalist way that misses a lot. But the thing is, I kept reading because he wrote such beautiful sentences. There may be no greater prose stylist in English than Gibbon. The beauty of his paragraphs is extraordinary. So that's a classic example. I will now, at this point, I will read just for the style, because I've given up on this writer as a source of wisdom, but I still believe they know how to do beautiful sentences.
I think it was the Civil War historian Shelby Foote who he read Proust all the time, and this is exactly what he said. I just have to read In Search of Lost Time over and over and over because of the way that his style infuses into my writing. And I know different writers who they'll read a certain kinds of books when they're not writing, but once they write, they actually don't want to be influenced by content. They just want to be influenced by style. They swivel the spotlight on the kind of books that they actually read.
Well, I told you when I did Delta Blues, I read books by Southern writers to try to get that prose style there. And there are writers that I will read just for the sheer enjoyment of the style. Does not mean I'm going to imitate them. It doesn't mean I'm going to imitate them. But I believe that it's useful to see the many different ways you can write and to understand the full range of possibilities of written expression. And then you find your own home there, you find your own place there. But yeah, I will read some writers just because I love the way they put together a sentence.
I want to dive into specifically how you attack a question in a research project head on. And right now you're focused on the shift from the sort of post-Enlightenment rationality into romanticism from like 1750 to 1850. So you have that question. That question is way beyond my ability to, like, I wouldn't even know how I would attack that. So how have you been doing it from a what you read perspective, the questions, the writing that you're doing? How does all of that come together?
Okay, well, that's a good example because I haven't written much about this. It's ongoing research. The premise is very simple. Let me give you the premise I'm researching. But you'll see to actually write about it, it's a huge amount of research. But the premise is simple. Here's my thought, that right now we live in a society that is overly run by technology, rationalism, algorithms, the STEM thinking. Everything is reduced to computer code and mathematics. And we need more of a reawakening of our humanistic sensibility, our creative, artistic side.
Like an intuition?
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of caring about human beings rather than about computer code. Sure. So I look at it and I say the problem with technology now is that people think progress is a new technology, but progress is flourishing human beings. And I'm worried that the leaders in our society now think that just expanding our technology, which now increasingly feels manipulative and controlling, that this is actually doing more harm than good. And we need a reawakening and a celebration of the human spirit, human creativity, even human rights. And so anyway, my hypothesis is that the situation in 1800 was exactly the same. In that you had the Industrial Revolution, people are building factories. It's the age of reason. People want to do everything rationally and logically or algorithmically. People call it the Enlightenment. Everything must be done according to the rules and scientific method. And around 1800, people felt that was too constraining. And all of a sudden, we have something that's called Romanticism. And for 100 years, it dominated Western culture, is Romanticism, which is celebrating the artistic spirit. So all of a sudden, poets are more famous than financiers and industrialists. People can't imagine now how famous Lord Byron was, or Keats, or Shelley. If I ask people today to name a living poet, they can't. But in the beginning of Romanticism, poets were celebrities. Beethoven was a celebrity. Goethe was a celebrity. Creative people were considered the legislators of the universe. And so I thought, and then great things happened as a result of that. For example, in the 1820s, they finally have child labor laws. Why didn't they have those in the Age of Reason? Why didn't they have those at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution? They were so focused on profits and maximizing efficiency, you don't get child labor laws until the 1820s. And then finally you get rid of slavery, but this happened during the Romanticist era. You would think, why didn't the Age of Reason, why didn't the Enlightenment thinkers get rid of slavery? But you actually needed the humanistic, creative, artistic thinkers to do these things. So my hypothesis is something happened around the year 1800 that changed the world for the better, and we need the same thing right now. That's my view. Now, how do I research that? I said, well, I don't know enough about Romanticism. So I go there and I'm reading Lord Byron. I'm reading all the prophetic works of William Blake, who was a tremendous critic of the Industrial Revolution. He said these factories are the dark satanic mills.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And so Blake, and for Blake, if you use the word Isaac Newton, that was like an insult. If he said, today we think Isaac Newton is a great scientist, but for Blake, you wanted the creative spirit. And so I'm reading Blake, I'm reading his prophetic poetry, which is very dense and difficult. So I have to go and get these biographies and literary commentaries, Shelley, Keats, and then I have to understand the French Revolution, which was the collapse of rationalism, because the French Revolution wanted to reconstruct a society on reason, and then they ended up with the Reign of Terror, where they're killing each other. The guillotine came out, and the revolutionaries literally started executing each other.
I thought I saw Edmund Burke in your file.
So the great original sources on the French Revolution I have to learn now. So you have to read Burke, The Ancien Regime by Tocqueville. You have to read Carlyle's French Revolution, like 3 thick volumes there. And I have to read through the novels. And I've read a lot of it already. So I have read, I have read Faust, and I've read a lot of Rousseau, and I've read a lot of Voltaire. I've already read a lot of this, but basically, I've been working on this for 18 months, 24 months, trying to understand what happened with the rise of Romanticism as a powerful moment of change in our society where human beings were important again. And creativity and artistry did that, and it saved us from an algorithmic, rationalistic society that was just trying to maximize profits. And I'm saying this, and this is the key thing. I'm not doing this because I love history. I'm not doing this because I love the past. The thing is, I care about the future. And so my thought is, I can learn something from this. My reading can do this, and then I can translate it into my writing, and hopefully I can write something that's fair, convincing, honest, and has a positive impact on society. That's on our culture. That's what motivates me at this stage of my life.
Right before we recorded, I asked you about Julian Jaynes and the origins of consciousness, and he has this theory that basically people had this direct interface with gods that got removed. They almost heard these voices. And William Blake, he also saw things. He had these crazy bouts of inspiration, and a little strange what's going on there. So what do you make of, where do writers get inspiration? And what do you make of these very surreal and enchanted stories about what certain writers have seen and heard?
I've got to say that over the course of my life, I have become less rationalistic and more metaphysical. And I even feel that there's a danger I'm going to become mystical at some point, where I'm going to become like a mystic. I have to restrain myself, because increasingly, and I'll give you background.
Why would that be a bad thing?
Well, because we live in a society that prizes rationalism and empiricism.
Okay.
This was a big thing when I studied philosophy at Oxford. Empiricism was the reigning theory of philosophy in England, the Anglo-American philosophical tradition. At Oxford, it was everywhere. And unless you could sense something, you could see it, you could feel it, you could taste, you could hear it, didn't exist. Sure. This was the essence of their philosophical tradition. And this was force-fed into me, and I became very skeptical. And what I said was, this is not correct, because the most important things in our life cannot be sensed with our sense organs. Well, what do you mean, Ted? You're talking about ghosts? No, I'm talking about things like love.
Right.
Friendship. How could I prove empirically that my wife loves me? How could I prove empirically that I love her? This is a leap of faith. It's almost like a religious experience. Trust, friendship, all these things are not empirical, but they're the foundation of our entire life. So I reached a decision when I was in my 20s that the most important things in our lives are things you could not see, you could not even prove they exist. Now, once you go down that path, though, once you begin going down the path of metaphysics, that I believe in things I can't see, this opens you up to all sorts of experiences, but also conflict with our world, because we live in a very STEM-oriented, rationalistic, empirical world. So let's get back to where do writers find inspiration?
Yeah, the Muses, William Blake.
If you go back in time, people believed that the artistic inspiration was like this, was metaphysical. In the ancient times, the muse, the goddess, would actually give you the poem. Hesiod was a shepherd, and the muse appeared to Hesiod. Here is the inspiration for your poetry. At the very beginning of Homer, he thanks the muse. Milton thanks the muse. Virgil and the Aeneid thanks the muse. The first thing you do is thank the goddess that gave you the artistic inspiration. Now, you were talking about Blake, and I was studying Blake recently for this Romanticism project. What many people don't know is Blake was a great poet, but he got this from voices he heard and visions he had. He had his first vision at age 4.
Huh.
At age 8, he told his parents that he had a vision, saw a tree, and it was shining like stars in the night sky from the glistening of the angels' wings. His dad tried to give him a beating. His mother intervenes, and you can't beat our little Billy. He's just a little kid. And a short while later, William Blake went to his mother and said, I had another vision today. I saw the prophet Ezekiel out in the garden. Well, then she gave him a beating. You can't say this, Your father will beat you. But this was how he got his inspiration. Now, people will say, well, he was crazy. He was schizophrenic. He had a mental illness. Now, this is a good question. Did he have a mental illness? I'm writing about this right now. Is if you are an artist and you have a vision, are you crazy? But what people don't realize is this is much more prevalent than anyone knows. I mean, Robert Frost heard voices. Every day of his life, Robert Frost heard voices. This goes into his poetry. Now, let's look at music. What I find very interesting is I look at the dream.
The dream.
The dream. When you fall asleep, I write about sleeping more than any music critic in history.
Huh.
Because why do I write about sleeping? Is when you have a dream, this is everybody's chance to have an out-of-body experience and to have something crazy. So even if you don't have visions like William Blake or Robert Frost, in your dreams you will have these experiences. And I started doing research on when great songs were written in dreams. People have no idea how common this is. I'll just give you a few examples. Paul McCartney's most successful song was Yesterday.
Yesterday.
It was picked by a poll of the BBC as the best song of the 20th century. Came to him in a dream. Another one of his huge hits was Let It Be. Came to him in a dream. The Rolling Stones' biggest hit was I Can't Get No Satisfaction. The riff came to Keith Richards in a dream. In fact, the story is amazing. He wakes up in the morning and there's a tape recorder. He plays the tape and it's got the riff to Satisfaction. He doesn't even remember doing it, but apparently in the middle of the night,
in the
middle of the night, he gets up from sleep, records it, goes back to sleep. Next morning, it's on his tape recorder.
He has no recollection.
No recollection of it. Came in a dream. Billy Joel's biggest hit, Just the Way You Are, came to him in a dream. Sting's biggest hit with The Police, Every Breath You Take, came to him in a dream. Carl Perkins, the rock singer, Blue Suede Shoes, the song came to him in a dream. So I started going to musicians, like on Twitter. I say, tell me situations in which you got musical inspiration in a dream. You can't believe how many musicians reached out to me. Huge numbers. And they're ashamed to talk about this for a variety of reasons. First of all, it seems crazy if you get a song. Someone gave you a song in a dream. This is like the vision quest of the Native Americans. Where you go on a vision quest, you'd have a vision and you'd get a song, a magical song. This happens all the time. And they don't want to talk about it. And also, when you do have inspiration, you're very protective of where that inspiration comes from. You're worried if I talk about it too much, it won't happen again.
Right.
So if I get a great idea in a dream, I may not want to tell people because this is my own little secret here. But the bottom line is the situation today is no different than what it was for Homer or Virgil or for these other poets that thank the muse. We still get this inspiration from wild, crazy, visionary places, and that we should nurture this, we should trust it, and we certainly shouldn't mock or ridicule it. And I think a lot of that happens.
Let me challenge you on it being no different. And it kind of comes from your book on jazz, where you talk about the challenges of trying to get jazz into notation. You almost try to tame it and constrain it. You'll have better language for it. But if you look at people like Walter Ong and Marshall McLuhan, they really talk about how the invention of writing and typography changed consciousness. Do you think that with the sort of Gutenberg revolution, we did lose a sense of that enchantedness?
Well, for example, I have disagreements with Walter Ong, who talks about orality, but you read his book, he never talks about music. And a lot of these people, they're talking about, you have text and it's great, but the spoken word is important. And I agree with all that. But there's this musicals realm too. And I believe there's a continuum between the song and the writing. And I'm distrustful of theorists that try to make it too rationalistic and logical and rigorous and scientific. I believe that we need to tap into the magic of our universe and the magical potential of our universe. The reason why the dream is so important is this is the last safe place we have to tap into something crazy, wild, magical, and unpredictable. I think if we lived in a less rationalistic universe, we might be able to just to tap into that by wandering around in the garden or climbing the mountain to the mountaintop or going on a retreat or whatever. Nowadays, for most of us, the only chance we have for that strange out-of-body experiences in our sleep or dreams, or maybe taking hallucinogenics, which I don't do. I'm a sober person. So for me, I have to get my out-of-body experience through music or these other things too. But we need to take that seriously, and we shouldn't try to overly theorize it, and we shouldn't try to mock or dismiss it.
How do you try to cultivate these things in your writing? Or is there a time when you felt like you had one of these mystical, muse-like experiences?
First thing I do in the morning is try to remember my dreams. The very first thing I do in the morning is try to remember my dreams. And if I can do that, nothing frustrates me more than to wake up and I can feel I just had a dream and I cannot grab the details of it. This frustrates me enormously. And people will say, well, what possible benefit? Let's say you dreamt you were on a Ferris wheel wearing your pajamas. What possible benefit could this have to your life? And I said, no, I want to tap into the deeper parts of my unconsciousness, and I want stuff that will jar me out of the predictability of my day-to-day life. And so I'm constantly seeking ways to expose myself to unpredictability. This also gets back to my reading. I read the strangest books. I read the books where the writer is going to impose their worldview on me.
Like Gerard.
That's right, where they're not going to give me what I want. They're not going to give me what I expect. They are going to force me to go down their path and see the world from their eyes.
There's a real arrogance in that, in a good way.
No, absolutely. And okay, sometimes it's a crazy maniac and you get that and you throw that book aside. But for the most part, the same reason why I try to remember my dreams is the same reason why I try to expose myself to these extraordinarily visionary writers or musicians or whatever. They are going to broaden my mind. They're going to broaden my horizons. They're going to give me things that I could have never come up on my own. And to me, that's the essence of the creative life.
Can I throw out a few one-word people, genres, and I just want to hear about, when you think of their writing style, what do you think of? So we can kind of do a fire round.
Okay.
The Beatles.
Love the Beatles. What I like is their desire to push themselves more than their fans. The fans always wanted them to repeat themselves. That's why they got so many bad reviews. They'd come out with a new album, would get bad reviews, and the Beatles kept pushing themselves harder than the marketplace or the fans did. So the Beatles are on my Mount Rushmore.
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, the same thing. Was willing to be very poetic, willing to be a rebel, and also what I liked about it is he did new things, but it was very rooted in the tradition. I think he saw himself as an extension of Woody Guthrie and the old traditional folk singers. So he had this beautiful thing of taking what's old and turning it into something new. And to me, he's a constant inspiration.
Gospel music.
Gospel music is very interesting because the older it is, the more I like it. When it becomes too slick, for example, I would say, you want me to listen to Christian music? I'll chant the Psalms, or listen to Bach. I like the closer to the source you can get in gospel and spiritual music, the better.
So like just sing the Psalms rather than the new stuff.
For me, I will actually, this sounds crazy. If you have hymns and you want me to rank them from favorite to least favorite, you could almost do them chronologically. If this was copyrighted in 1911, I probably like it better than the one copyrighted in 1950.
Right. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound.
No, that did.
Yeah.
I want to, particularly in anything having to do with spirituality, I want to go back to the source, or the source up there,
Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, I have made my peace with Taylor Swift because I'm very resistant to the simplicity of modern music and the four-chord song. But I love Taylor Swift in that she's creating transformative experiences for her audience, life-changing ones in live music. And like I said, I've watched the documentary, which has the full Eras concert, all 3 hours of it. I watched it 3 times, primarily to watch the audience. I mean, it's great watching Taylor Swift, but what I love seeing is the people in the audience are having an ecstatic experience. It's almost like one of these amazing muse-inspired experiences I'm talking about in the creative moment. You see it actually more in the audience than you do in Taylor Swift. So I like what she's doing to the culture from the point of view of energizing and giving vitality to the audience.
The writing, the freestyling of Eminem.
Eminem, to me, there's too much of a pose on these things. See, this is where a lot of the hip hop to me is the problem I had with when I talk about music critics early on. You're so much focused on the cool pose and setting a persona out for the audience. I think extraordinarily creative and artistic, but I would like something that was a little less of a dramatic stance.
You wrote your 12 favorite problems, and I want to ask about a few of them. This comes from Feynman. He basically says, keep a list of 12 favorite problems in your head, let them marinate, let them stew. Many years later, you might even come up with an answer to one of them, and then all of a sudden they'll say, how'd you do that? You're a genius. You've really just been working on these 12 favorite problems. But I want to take these and apply them to writing. So I'll ask them back to you. How can creativity, intellectual vitality, and learning be maintained in the face of inescapable obstacles, such as earning a living or aging or financial hardship or residing far from major cultural centers?
Well, this is important. I think that people that are learning writing at writing schools are being misled often. And they're told, well, just follow your heart and everything's going to be great and you'll be, good things will happen to you on their own. And I've always told people, get some marketable skills too. It's very interesting when I go to these colleges and they put me in front of writing students. The teacher will introduce me and they'll say, today we have Ted here. He's written 12 books. He writes for these famous periodicals. But he also got an MBA from Stanford and did business work. He's going to talk about writing today. And I'll say, what questions you have? You know what question I get all the time is, how did you earn a living and balance work and writing? People want an honest answer to this. And if you just say, I'm going to teach you how to use adverbs well, you're not being honest with them. So I believe any writer has constant struggles. My writing is not bringing enough money to pay the bills. How do I handle this? Or I want to be a writer. I want to spend time with my kids too. How do I handle this? I want to be a writer, but I really need to live in New York and I don't. How do I handle this? So to me, this is a big issue. I don't think it's talked about enough. I was absolutely determined to do writing without sacrificing these other things. I was going to earn a living. I was going to have a good family life. I was going to live where I want to, not in a city that is, I find alienating just to advance my career. And I think this is a huge issue. We should talk honestly about it. And it would be great if at an early age, people that were learning to be writers were told about these things in very honest language.
How do I avoid becoming a narrow specialist or a superficial generalist? Is there a third way? If so, how do I get there?
Well, the philosopher Unamuno once said, as a writer, you have two options and they're both bad. You can become a dilettante or a pedant. And the dilettante knows about a lot of things, but in a very shallow way. The pedant knows about one thing a lot, but is very tiresome and boring to listen to. So this is the choice you make. And I thought, well, I'm going to find a balance between these. And so as a writer, what I've tried to do is to find certain areas I specialize in, but not at such an obsessive level that
you get the hammer nail problem.
That's right. I know jazz writers that can tell you how many hairs Cannonball Adderley had on his back.
Right.
And I'm not going to do that. I'm never going to get into that level of granularity. There are plenty of scholars out there doing it. They can have articles on, well, I counted a hair that this guy missed and, whatever. But what I want to do is to have a certain level of I want to have a certain level of deep knowledge, but not to the point where it becomes obsessive. So what I will do, for example, is I will decide I want to learn about a certain subject, and I will read 40 or 50 books on that one subject. And then I'll go on to something else. Now, after reading 40 and 50 books, I am not ready to be a professor. But I know a hell of a lot. Once you've read 40 or 50 books on a subject, you do know quite a bit. You saw my library upstairs.
Yep.
You see that I've got, 30, 40 books on the music of the ancient Romans. I've got 30, 40 books on the music of the ancient Greeks or whatever. So what I find is I do a deep dive enough to give me some authority so I can speak with knowledge, but not so much so that I get to that granular level and become tiresome to my readers.
This is my favorite of the four. How can I protect or nurture local styles and perspectives in an increasingly globalized and homogenized culture?
This has been important to me from the very start of my vocation. I had grown up in Los Angeles, and I said, I'm going to write a book on West Coast jazz. And so it was a regional style. And I liked the idea of a regional style, something that happened in the area where I grew up, and I would understand the specificity of it and how certain local conditions created something that couldn't happen anywhere else in the world. And so I wrote that book, and then when I did the Delta Blues, and I started doing this, I was writing about New Orleans, and I realized that this is the endangered species in culture. We talk about endangered species with birds or animals or whatever, but within culture, the endangered species is the local regional style. I remember traveling around the world on my business career. I would always go and try to sample the local music. But at a certain point, I found you couldn't sample the local music. It was disappearing. So I would be in Indonesia, and I would go into a record store, and they would have Madonna, Rod Stewart, the Beatles.
I heard Taylor Swift in Casablanca, and I was like, what is going on?
And I went to the guy who said, I want some traditional Indonesian music. And the clerk there looks at me like I'm crazy. Nobody wants this, And so this is a tragedy in our culture. I don't think it's sufficiently recognized, but I want to support local regional styles. We had in writing, there was a point in American culture where writers from the South wrote fundamentally differently from writers in the North or the West or whatever. I don't think that's true anymore. So I think we lose something when the world becomes so flattened and so homogenized. We lose that heterogeneity, as Hegel called it, or the diversity.
And even now, if you look at regional styles of the American accent, it's become more and more compressed.
Well, absolutely. We're sitting in Austin right now. And I had a visitor here recently. Guy came here to interview me, came from New York. And he was spending a day or two in Austin. And I'll say, this is what you're not going to see. You can walk through Austin. You're not going to hear any Texas accents. You're not going to see many people with cowboy hats, And I said, you can mock this, but I miss this. When I go someplace here and I hear somebody with a Texas accent, oh, this makes my day. It is sad that the whole culture of the country is becoming so homogenized. And it's the same, you go overseas and you find the McDonald's or whatever. It's very depressing to me. And if we're going to fight this anywhere, it has to be in the cultural, artistic, creative sphere. That's our last chance to create regional, local pockets of creativity. And anything I can do to help that, I do.
How can I operate honestly as a critic without absorbing all the negative psychic energy involved in criticism? How do I reconcile this vocation with my desire to act kindly and compassionately at all times?
This is very important to me. I have key values that are important in my life: kindness, love, forgiveness, compassion. And we live in a very hardball culture. We live in a culture of anger and outrage right now. And I could do a test. I could go on social media and I could offer various opinions on things. And what you'd find is the angrier I get, the more likely it is to go viral. So the culture rewards you for intolerance. And you literally get rewarded in our culture for being a jerk, anger, intolerance. And I refuse to play that game. And I've decided that there is a path to reaching an audience where you're measured, you're judicious, you're fair, you're kind. And I believe one of the reasons for my success as a writer is I have held to that. And I believe that there's actually now a hunger. You know, we talked about George Soros and the theory of reflexivity, where these trends eventually reverse. I believe we are within 5 or 10 years at most from the culture reversing from a culture of anger to a culture of kindness and compassion. And I want to be ahead of the curve on that. I've been trying for years to be ahead of the curve, and I believe now I see in the response I get to my own writing validates my view that we will become a kinder culture. We will become a more loving and forgiving culture. There are people already want that. There's a hunger for that. And I'm going to stake my career on that. That's absolutely important to me.
Well, I think a good example of that, and I want to put the chart on the screen right here, is your state of culture piece, where you talk about, maybe you can summarize it, but the decline in so many ways in culture from sports. So you play sports to you watch sports, now you gamble on sports. You play music, you listen to music, now you scroll TikTok videos. And you really hit on something there, and I think it's a good example because it's going viral for its perceptiveness, for its truth, rather than you getting angry at anything. I think that there is a undercurrent of, it's not vengeance, it's nowhere close to that, but it is a deep frustration and a sort of lament for the loss of what we used to have.
Well, I call it dopamine culture, and it's a culture of distraction. And this is fundamentally different than the past, because 20 years ago, if I'd had a debate with somebody about the culture, the debate would be about art versus entertainment. And the art is more demanding, it's more rigorous, it forces you out of your comfort zone. Entertainment is something that's more adapted to what your expectations are, it's more formulaic. But now we've got a third category. You've got art, you've got entertainment, and just distraction, like people scrolling on videos on their phone. Video of somebody's pet, or somebody showed a photo of their meal or something like that. That's not even entertainment.
Right.
You can't even call that entertainment. It's just distraction. And what we find is that it gives a jolt of dopamine to the brain. And the people that design these social media platforms, all of them in the last 12 to 18 months shifted to these scrolling, reeling interfaces. Now, they haven't told you why, but the reason why they're doing this is it's addictive. If you get a dopamine hit every 15 seconds, it's an addictive process. So you stay on your phone, they can give you more ads. This is no different than what companies do in other product areas. I knew some people that worked at a very large potato chip company, which I will not mention by name. But they said, well, Ted, you have no idea. We worked for years to find exactly how to have a potato chip so that you ate it and there was a flavor in your mouth and it died in a certain number of seconds, so you had to reach for another potato chip. We make these things addictive. The goal is to make them addictive because that's how we maximize sales. Now, nobody in Silicon Valley will tell you this, but all the Silicon Valley companies with these social media platforms have made similar research, I'm sure. And they show we have this scrolling interface, and so people are addicted to distraction. This can't be good for the culture. Now, you know where I come from. I come from sort of this timeless area. When I think about something happening in the culture, I'm thinking about it in terms of what happened over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years.
Sure.
And so the idea that now we've shifted to these quick dopamine hits is something of great concern to me. And once again, I will stake my career and my efforts on something that's more helpful to the culture and more helpful to society. Classic example, I choose what my values are, and then my work has to live up to those values. Otherwise, I'm not the honest broker.
So as a writer, how do if I don't like dopamine culture, but I kind of feel like I need to be part of dopamine culture, I feel like I need to have a good hook, feel like I need to bring somebody in right away, I feel like I need to get right to the point. What do I do?
Well, here's my advice, and other people will tell you differently, but I think that it's death to try to chase the culture. And I've seen a bunch of editors over the years who've told me, Ted, you got to dumb it down. It's got to be faster. It's got to be quicker. People don't want anything that's more challenging. What I'll tell you is all those editors are out of a job now.
Huh.
The periodicals they work for often have disappeared from the face of the earth because there's no long-term relationship you can have with a reader like this. I had a video of me somebody else put up on Instagram the other day that got 2 million views. 2 million views of me talking. But it's just a few seconds. And I was talking to my wife today. I said, this got me no readers. There's no trend. You can't engage with this. It's gratifying for my ego to have reached 2 million people there, but I cannot have any engagement on that platform. If I want to engage, I can engage with a video like we're doing because we're talking at length at things. This will engage with people. My writing can engage with people. If you do something at a level like this, you can engage with them. But when you work into the distraction culture, all you have is your 10 seconds of fame. Enjoy it, but you can't build on it. So I would tell writers, don't chase that. Be true to your own values. There are people that are hungry for something more substantive. We saw this in food. When I was growing up, the big thing were these high-tech foods, frozen foods, microwave meals, canned goods, all that. We've seen a reaction against it now. Gourmet cooking, healthy living, organic food, all these cuisines. The hot thing in food now is organic and natural. Those things actually are growing faster in the marketplace than the pre-processed stuff. I think the same thing will happen in writing. Have natural ingredients. Do it organically. Be true to quality. If you try to chase the tech platforms and this pre-digested stuff, you may have a few brief flurries of success, but you can't build a career like I have had over decades without the deeper engagement that kind of relationship with the reader requires.
At the risk of being reductive, what I'm going to try to do is summarize this conversation, and you'll let me know what I either got wrong or missed, okay? But I think that if I were to say, how do you write? It is, you spent decades reading voraciously, reading the classics, and reading not for entertainment, but to really expand your mind. And you did that day in and day out, day in and day out. And then you sort of rejected, I'm going to focus on style, I'm going to really focus on audience growth. And you've said at every juncture, especially more recently, I'm going to be as honest as possible. And I'm really going to focus on building trust with my readers with that direct relationship. And it's okay if I offend some people. But what matters is that I do not lose that sense of integrity. And that sense of integrity comes through trust. I'm going to do that day in and day out. And now the internet has allowed me to do that. I can publish on Substack. I can build a direct relationship with my readers. And I can write and publish when the article is ready, but I'm going to do it consistently enough. And then in that consistent writing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show up every single day and I'm going to write. But that time is going to start with reading in the morning, some time listening to music, and then I'm going to write generally later in the afternoon. I'm going to do that day in and day out. And we get judged for our outputs, but it's really the inputs that have mattered over the years for you. The inputs of listening to music and reading. And what did I leave out?
You did a great job.
There we go.
I would have thought what I said was just a jumble of things, but you made it sound very coherent. No, that's absolutely true. I will add one last thing. I know there are different paths for different people. My path may not be the identical one that other people will take towards success or towards happiness, but I believe in the one I've chosen. I will add one thing, though. is the approach I take is longer term and more cumulative. I'm absolutely a believer in how I did it, but it's not something that's going to pay off in 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. We need a slowness revolution in our whole culture right now, and I practice that myself. I do believe, though, if you want to build a career as a writer over the long term, 10, 20, 30, I've now been writing for publication for 50 years because I started when I was still in high school. If you want to do it over the long run and flourish over the long run, I do believe that the approach that you just summarized, I believe that works and it's the one that I endorse.
Ted Gioia, thanks for coming on How I Write.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That was fun.